Tonight, we finally own everything we wanted.
You celebrated before checking who controls the company.
What did you do, Lydia?
I took back what was never yours. The trust owns 51%. Your scheme is finished.
You cannot strip me of my own company.
You tried to erase my father's legacy.
Then I've already lost. You destroyed everything I built tonight.
Without power, you have nothing I want. You betrayed me before I ever fought back. Now my father's legacy comes home.
The night, Elliott Rhodes raised his champagne glass and declared himself the most powerful man in the room. The Harmon Family Trust had already transferred controlling interest in Rhodes' Capital Group away from him. 300 guests didn't know it. The board members toasting beside him didn't know it. Serena Wolfe, standing at his arm in a red gown, didn't know it. Only 2 people in the entire Sterling Hotel rooftop held the truth. That evening, Lydia Harmon, who stood near the back of the terrace in a dark green dress with her hands clasped in front of her, and Philip Crane, who had taken a quiet seat by the far window with a black leather briefcase balanced on his knees. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. 3 months earlier, none of this had felt inevitable. Or perhaps it always had been, and Lydia was simply the last person to accept it. Lydia Harmon had never been the kind of woman who took up space in a room. Not because she lacked the ability, but because she had learned early that the most important things happen quietly. Her father, Thomas Harmon, taught her that. He had spent 30 years building what eventually became Rhodes Capital Group, from a 2-person investment firm in a shared office building in Lower Manhattan, and he had done all of it without ever raising his voice or demanding anyone's admiration. Thomas built in silence. He taught his daughter to do the same. Lydia grew up watching her father work. She would sit at the corner of his desk on Saturday mornings, doing homework while he reviewed quarterly reports, and sometimes he would slide a page toward her and ask what she noticed. By the time she was studying finance at Georgetown, she could read a balance sheet faster than most analysts twice her age. She joined Thomas's firm at 26, not as the founder's daughter taking a comfortable job, but as an analyst who worked longer hours than anyone else in the office and asked for nothing her work hadn't earned. That was where she met Elliott Rhodes. He was 31 and hungry in the way that men who have something to prove always are. He had come through a top 10 business school on scholarship, worked 3 years at a mid-size bank, and arrived at Harmon Capital Partners with the kind of energy that filled corridors. Thomas liked him immediately. Lydia was more measured in her assessment, but she couldn't deny what she observed. Elliott worked hard, learned fast, and carried an instinct for deal structure that was genuinely uncommon. Their courtship had been slow and then sudden, the way these things sometimes go. 2 years of professional respect before either of them acknowledged anything more. When they finally did, Thomas gave them his blessing with characteristic understatement. He's good at the work. Make sure he's good at the rest. Elliott was good at the rest in those early years. Their marriage began in a small ceremony with 30 people, none of the glittering guest lists that would come later, and Thomas sat beside Lydia's mother and cried quietly when no one was looking. They built something together in those first few years. Lydia continued her work at the firm. Elliott rose steadily, earning his title as a genuine reflection of his capability. Then Thomas died. It happened 5 years ago, a cardiac event that the doctors said was fast and relatively merciful. Lydia sat in a hospital waiting room for 4 hours, before a physician came to tell her what she already knew from the way he walked toward her. Thomas had arranged everything with his characteristic forethought. The company's succession plan was documented. Elliott was named as the new CEO, and the Harmon Family Trust, holding 51% of all voting shares in the company, was placed entirely in Lydia's hands. She hadn't understood the full weight of it then. Philip Crane had explained the mechanics during the estate meeting, but Lydia had been in the particular fog of fresh grief that makes legal language feel abstract and distant. She signed what Philip told her to sign. She trusted that the structure her father built would hold. She trusted Elliott. For a while, that trust had seemed warranted. Elliott threw himself into the CEO role with genuine effort. He modernized the firm's strategy, expanded client emphasis, attracted top talent. He renamed the company Rhodes Capital Group. In his second year, Lydia had raised an eyebrow at that. But Elliott had framed it as rebranding for market positioning, and she had, in her grief and her habit of trusting him, let it pass. She should have paid more attention to what else was passing. Now, she stood at the edge of a rooftop garden, strung with light, watching 300 people celebrate the man she had married, and she kept her face entirely still. She watched Serena Wolf, VP of Strategy, hired 18 months ago, lean in to say something that made Elliott laugh loudly enough to turn heads. She watched Elliott's hand settle briefly at the small of Serena's back. She had known for months now. She had documented it, confirmed it, and had long since passed through the part of this that felt like heartbreak into something that felt more like resolve. Across the terrace, Philip Crane caught her eye. He set down his water glass. He gave her the smallest nod. The papers were already filed. The trust was already active. The merger Elliott was about to announce to 300 witnesses was already, legally, blocked. Whatever happened next, it had already begun. The first 4 years of their marriage had been genuinely good, and Lydia thought about that sometimes when she needed to be honest with herself. Not good in the way that people perform happiness for photographs, but good in the way that matters. Two people with common values building a shared life, comfortable enough in each other's company that silence never felt like a gap that needed filling. Elliott worked hard, and she respected that. He made decisions well under pressure, and she had seen that firsthand. He was funny in a dry, understated way that she hadn't expected, and occasionally he would surprise her, leaving a coffee on her desk before she arrived at the office, or showing up to her father's monthly dinners with the specific bottle Thomas preferred without being reminded. These were small things, but Lydia had always been more moved by small things done consistently than large gestures done once. Thomas liked Elliott. Not in a sentimental way. Her father was too precise for sentimentality, but in the way he liked people who showed up and did the work. He listens before he talks. Thomas had told her once, and from Thomas, that was high praise. Lydia had believed in Elliott the way she believed in compound interest. Quietly, over time, watching small deposits accumulate into something she couldn't have predicted from the beginning. The shift happened gradually enough that she questioned her own perception for longer than she should have. It began after Thomas died, which made sense in its way. Grief reshapes people, and stepping into the CEO role that Thomas had occupied for decades was not a small responsibility. Lydia had expected some adjustment. She had expected Elliott to need time. What she hadn't expected was to find herself slowly edited out of the picture she had helped paint. It started with the meetings. Elliott began scheduling strategy sessions without her, not in a hostile way, just efficiently. Because you've got enough on your plate, or this one's pretty inside baseball. She let it pass. Then the quarterly presentations started going to the board directly, without her review, despite the fact that her financial modeling had been embedded in the structure of those reports for 6 years. When she pointed this out, Elliott had looked genuinely puzzled, as if he had forgotten she had ever done that work. "I'll loop you in next cycle," he said. He didn't. The renaming was the moment she should have paid closer attention. When Elliott proposed changing the company name from Harmon Capital Partners to Rhodes Capital Group in his second year as CEO, Lydia had felt some tighten in her chest. But he had framed it carefully: market positioning, modern brand identity, distinguishing from the old structure, and she had been in the particular exhaustion of 2 years of grief, and she had signed the internal vote without a full fight. It was only afterward that she realized he had taken her father's name off the building her father built. She thought about that often now. The arrival of Serena Wolf 18 months ago had accelerated everything. Lydia had noticed nothing alarming at first. Serena was competent, organized, quick to understand complex deal structures. Elliott spoke about her the way he had once spoken about a promising analyst at their firm, with the particular enthusiasm of someone who has found a tool that works exactly as advertised. Lydia had assumed it would level out, as professional admiration usually did once the novelty faded. Instead, it deepened. The late evenings extended. The references to Serena in everyday conversation became background noise. Elliott stopped asking Lydia's opinion on deals he would once have walked her through at the kitchen table. He stopped including her name in emails that referenced company decisions. He stopped looking at her the way a person looks at someone they consider essential. Lydia was not naive. She understood what the pattern of behavior suggested, but she also understood something that her father had taught her about decision-making. Feelings are information, not verdicts. You collect the evidence before you draw the conclusion. You confirm before you act. She confirmed on a Tuesday evening in March. Elliott had left his laptop open on the desk in the study, screen unlocked, a document visible. He had stepped out to take a call, and Lydia had walked in to retrieve a book she'd left there. She hadn't planned to read what was on the screen. But the title at the top of the document stopped her mid-step. Phase 2 Restructuring. Share Reclassification Proposal. She stood very still for a moment. Then she took her phone out of her pocket and photographed every visible page without touching the laptop, without moving anything, without making a sound. When Elliott came back 10 minutes later, she was sitting in the armchair across the room with her book open in her lap, looking for all the world like a woman who had not just photographed evidence that her husband was quietly maneuvering to strip her of 51% of her father's legacy. "Good call," she asked. "Just a board thing," he said, and closed the laptop. She turned a page she hadn't read. "I'm sure it will all work out," she said, and she meant it, just not in the way he would have assumed. That night, after Elliott was asleep, she sent an email to an attorney she had looked up 3 weeks earlier, a corporate specialist named Dana Marsh, recommended by a former colleague with no connection to Rhodes Capital or to Philip Crane. The subject line was brief: "I need a consultation. Urgent and confidential." Dana replied at 7 the next morning. They met 2 days later. Dana Marsh's office was on the 22nd floor of a building in Midtown that Lydia had walked past hundreds of times without ever having a reason to enter. It was a deliberately unremarkable office, clean lines, neutral colors, a single shelf of legal texts along one wall, and Dana herself was the kind of person whose authority was communicated entirely through precision rather than display. She reviewed the photographs Lydia had taken in under 4 minutes, and then set her phone face down on the desk. "How familiar are you with your company's current shareholder structure?" Dana asked. "Enough to understand that the Harmon Family Trust holds 51% of the voting shares." Lydia said, "My father established the trust before his death. I'm the sole trustee. Have you been an active or passive trustee?" Lydia paused. "Passive. I've signed documents when Philip Crane, my father's attorney and the trust's co-administrator, sent them. I receive annual reports. I've never attended a board meeting as a trustee." Dana nodded, and something in her expression told Lydia that this was important. "The restructuring proposal you photographed," Dana said, "is designed to create a new class of shares with restricted voting rights. If implemented, the Harmon Trust would retain its economic interest, but lose its voting majority. That would drop your effective control to below 50%. Lydia already suspected this. Hearing it stated plainly still did something to her breathing. "Can he do that without my consent?" "No. Major restructuring requires majority shareholder approval, which means it requires your approval as trustee." Dana looked at her evenly. "But there's a window here that concerns me. If you've been passive, there could be an argument, a weak one, but an argument that the trustee position has been constructively delegated. That's the kind of gray area opposing counsel would try to exploit. What do you recommend? You need to formally assert your role as active trustee. File the appropriate documentation with the state and with the company's corporate secretary. Make your position legally unambiguous before he files the restructuring proposal." Dana folded her hands on the desk. "And I'd recommend you move quickly." "How far along is the proposal?" "I don't know. The document I saw appeared to be in draft stage, but I can't confirm the timeline. Then we move as though we have less time than we probably do." Dana pulled a legal pad toward her. "One more question. The affair? Do you compensation?" Lydia had not mentioned an affair. She watched Dana's expression. Is that relevant? It could be. Depending on how any divorce proceedings are structured, it may affect asset claims. And if your husband has been involving his, Dana chose the word carefully, a personal relationship in company business decisions, that could have governance implications. I have hotel receipts charged to a shared account, Lydia said, calendar entries. A message exchange I was not meant to see. She had told herself she would keep her voice neutral when discussing this, and she managed it. I can document it formally. Do that, and don't confront him. Not yet. Lydia had no intention of confronting Elliott. Confrontation was his preferred terrain. He was good at it, quick, persuasive, able to reframe any conversation in real time. The only way to counter someone like that was to act before they knew you were moving. I understand, she said. She left Dana's office with a clear action plan and a carefully ordered silence inside her chest. The hurt was still there. She wasn't numb. She had never been the kind of person who could cauterize feeling, but it had been moved to a different room for now. There was work to be done. She called Philip Crane that afternoon. Philip's voice on the phone was exactly as she remembered, measured, careful, with the particular gentleness of someone who had spent decades delivering important information to people who were not always prepared to receive it. She had not spoken with him in nearly 18 months. She had been operating, as she told Dana, as a passive trustee, which meant Philip handled the routine administration, and she signed what he mailed to her. He had never pressed her to be more involved. She wondered now if he had been waiting. I want to meet, she said, this week if possible. A brief pause. Are you well, Lydia? I will be, she said. I need to understand everything my father put in place. Everything, not the summary version. Another pause, shorter this time. Of course, Philip said. Thursday afternoon. My office. That was 2 weeks before the gala. In those 2 weeks, Lydia collected what she needed with the same patient, systematic attention she had once applied to her father's quarterly reports. She kept her routines unchanged. She attended the gala planning committee walkthrough. She answered Elliott's messages without delay. She sat across from him at dinner 3 times and said nothing that would alert him to what was accumulating beneath the surface. She was thorough, she was patient, and she was very, very quiet. On Wednesday evening, 7 days before the gala, Elliott came home from a late meeting in a buoyant mood that he made no attempt to explain. He poured himself a drink and told her the Sterling rooftop was going to be incredible, and that he expected the announcement to change everything. He said it with the unself-conscious confidence of someone who had never once considered that something might already have changed without his awareness. Lydia smiled and said she was sure it would go well. She was sure of very different things. Philip Crane's office looked the way it had always looked, which was to say it looked like a place where serious things were kept safe. Dark shelving, leather chairs, files organized in a way that suggested the information inside them was treated with genuine respect. Philip himself was 71 now, the same trim build Lydia had known since childhood, with reading glasses he didn't apologize for needing, and a habit of letting silence sit between sentences without filling it unnecessarily. He had worked with Thomas Harmon for 28 years. He had been at her parents' wedding and at Thomas's funeral. He was, in the way that certain professional relationships become something more family. He put a binder on the desk between them and opened it without preamble. Your father established the Harmon Family Trust in Town 1, Philip said, 2 years after he founded the investment firm. At the time, the company was small, 6 employees, 1 office, 2 institutional clients. But Thomas had a habit of thinking ahead. Philip settled his reading glasses. The trust was structured to hold 51% of all voting shares in the company. Not economic shares, voting shares. The distinction is important. Lydia leaned forward slightly. Explain the distinction. Economic shares entitle you to a portion of profits and value. Voting shares determine who controls decisions. Your father was very clear about which mattered more to him. Philip turned a page in the binder. He anticipated that the company would grow. He anticipated that other people would take on leadership roles. He was willing to let someone else run day-to-day operations. He was not willing to let someone else make decisions about the company's future without your knowledge and approval. Lydia absorbed this. Elliott doesn't know the trust holds voting control. Philip was quiet for a moment. Elliott was presented with a standard shareholder summary when he joined the board, and later when he became CEO. That summary described the Harmon Trust as a major equity holder. It did not emphasize the voting structure in terms that would have prompted someone who wasn't looking for it to ask follow-up questions. He paused. Your husband is intelligent, but he is also someone who tends to gather information transactionally. What does he need to know right now for the decision in front of him? He didn't need to know about the trust's voting structure to run the company day to day. So he didn't look closer, and now he's trying to restructure around it. Yes. Philip closed the binder gently. I became aware of the Phase 2 restructuring proposal approximately 6 weeks ago, when a draft was circulated to a subset of the board for preliminary comment. I should have called you then. I waited because I was not certain the proposal would move forward, and I didn't want to alarm you unnecessarily. He looked at her steadily over his glasses. I was wrong to wait. I apologize. Lydia shook her head. Tell me what I can do. Philip explained the option with the same clear, methodical patience he had used to explain the estate to her 5 years ago. As active trustee, Lydia could formally assert her voting rights on any company matter. She could approve or reject board decisions that required shareholder sign-off. She could object to restructuring proposals and, in doing so, stop them from proceeding. The trustee activation was a formal legal step. It required a filing with the state and formal notification to the company's corporate secretary. But there was nothing in the trust's structure that limited her right to make it. The proposed merger with Valoris International, Philip said, requires majority shareholder approval. That's stared for a transaction of this magnitude. Elliott hasn't requested it. He's likely planning to request it after the gala announcement, once the deal is public knowledge and the board is formally convened. He would assume it's a formality. Philip's expression remained neutral, but something in it was very precise. He has not considered the possibility that the majority shareholder might decline. Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, My father left me a letter. Philip reached into the binder without surprise and produced a sealed envelope. Her name was written on the front in Thomas's handwriting, careful, deliberate, the way he wrote everything. She hadn't known it existed until this moment, and the sight of it did something to the controlled steadiness she had maintained for weeks. She breathed through it. Philip set the envelope in front of her and gave her privacy. She opened it alone in the room after Philip stepped out. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten, dated 4 months before Thomas died. He had known by then that the cardiac issues were serious. He had written this in the certain knowledge that she might never need it, and in the equal certainty that she might. He wrote about the company, why he built it, what it had meant to him, what he hoped it would become. He wrote about her mother. He wrote in a single paragraph about Elliott that he had trusted him with the work because Elliott was good at the work, and that he hoped this trust would prove permanent. But he had been a careful man his whole life, and careful men plan for contingencies. If you are reading this, Thomas wrote, then something has happened that required you to open the door I built for you. I hope whatever it was hurt less than you feared. I suspect it didn't. That's all right. You have always been stronger than you believed, and you have always been more prepared than you knew. The trust isn't a weapon, Lydia. It's a key. Use it to secure what matters. She folded the letter and put it in her bag. When Philip came back in, she was dry-eyed and had already made her decision. File the activation, she said. Today. Philip sat down, uncapped his pen, and began to write. Elliott Rhodes woke at 5:45 on the morning of the gala and felt, for the first time in months, genuinely light. The day was finally here. He had been building toward this announcement for nearly 18 months, structuring the Valoris deal, managing the board's hesitations, navigating the regulatory questions that came with any cross-border merger of this scale. He had done it methodically, carefully, with Serena Wolf's strategic precision complementing his own instinct for what investors needed to hear and when. The announcement tonight would triple Rhodes Capital Group's assets under management. It would put him on the cover of at least 3 financial publications. It would cement his name, not the Harmon name he had quietly let fade, as synonymous with a new generation of investment leadership. He showered, reviewed his talking points in the mirror, and sent Serena a message before 7. She called back immediately. They spoke for 40 minutes about the evening's sequence, his opening remarks, her brief presentation on the strategic rationale, the Q&A format, the post-announcement cocktail reception. They had rehearsed this so many times it felt automatic now, and Elliott let himself enjoy the ease of it, working with someone who matched his energy, who understood what he was building, who didn't need things explained twice. He had already spoken with his paternal financial advisor about the next steps. After the announcement, after the merger formally closed, he intended to initiate divorce proceedings. He had begun some preliminary asset relocations, standard practice when a major financial event was coming that would change one's tax situation, and his advisor had asked no questions. These things were handled all the time. It was clean and clinical and would be over within a year. What he had not done in the days before the gala was check his board communications inbox. He used a separate system for routine trustee and governance notifications, a different email address that fed into a dashboard he reviewed once a week, usually Sunday mornings. Sunday had slipped by in the gala preparation. He hadn't checked. He didn't know that Philip Crane's formal trustee activation filing had been registered with the state on Thursday at noon. He didn't know that Dana Marsh had submitted a formal majority shareholder objection to the Valoris merger and to the Phase 2 share reclassification proposal on Friday afternoon. He didn't know that Rhodes Capital Group's corporate secretary, a careful man named Walter Reed, who had worked at the company since Thomas Harmon's time, had reviewed those filings on Friday at 3 o'clock, recognized their significance immediately, and dispatched formal notifications to all 8 members of the board of directors before the end of business. He didn't know that 7 of those 8 board members had read the notification, and that 6 of the 7 had replied with variations of confirmed receipt and will review before the gala. He didn't know that David Chen, the board's most senior member, who had attended the firm's first investor dinner back in 2002, and who had always maintained a particular respect for Thomas Harmon's way of doing things, had called Philip Crane at 4 on Friday afternoon and spoken with him for 31 minutes. Elliott Rhodes knew none of this. He put on a navy suit, chose his cufflinks, and drove himself to the Sterling Hotel, feeling like a man whose future was arriving exactly on schedule. 2 miles away, in the apartment they still shared because no decisions had been formalized yet, Lydia had already been awake for 2 hours. She wasn't anxious. That surprised her a little, and then didn't. She had moved through anxiety weeks ago, when the weight of the decision was still in question. Now that the decision was made and irreversible, she felt the particular calm of knowing where she stood. She made coffee, reviewed the summary Philip had prepared for her, a precise outline of the trust's voting rights, the objection filings, and what legally could and couldn't happen at tonight's event, and then set it aside because she had already memorized what she needed to know. She had chosen a dark green dress, her father's signet ring on her right hand, which she wore every day but which people rarely noticed because it was not the kind of thing people noticed about her. She had one phone call that morning, with Dana Marsh at 8. "Everything is in place," Dana said. "The corporate secretary has confirmed receipt and board notification. The objection filings are legally operative. Nothing can be undone tonight. And if Elliott tries to proceed with the announcement regardless, he can announce whatever he likes. The deal cannot close without majority shareholder approval. The board members in attendance tonight are fully aware of this." A brief pause. He may not know yet. He may find out tonight for the first time, in front of 300 people. "I want you to be prepared for that." Lydia looked out the window at the city below. "I've been preparing for it for 3 months," she said. She arrived at the Sterling 40 minutes after Elliott and Serena, by design. She took the elevator to the rooftop alone, adjusted her father's ring, and walked through the terrace doors into the warm light and the noise of a celebration that was already underway. Philip Crane, seated quietly near the window with his briefcase on the floor beside him, gave her the smallest nod as she entered. She returned it and moved to her table. The Sterling Hotel's rooftop terrace was exactly what an investment firm's celebration was designed to look like: deliberate, polished, and curated to project confidence. String lights ran the perimeter above the low planters of clipped hedges. A city skyline filled the eastern view, lights sharpening in the October dark. The catering tables were set in marble-topped rows, servers in white gloves moving between clusters of guests with champagne and small plates of food that cost more per bite than most people's lunches. 300 guests had arrived in suits and gowns, and the practiced ease of people who attended events like this often enough to know exactly how to navigate them. Elliott was in the center of all of it when Lydia arrived, which was exactly where she expected him to be. He stood near the bar with a knot of investors. She recognized two of them from board meetings she had attended in Thomas's time, one hand around a champagne flute, the other moving as he made a point. He was good at this. She had always acknowledged that. He understood how to hold a room, how to make people feel that his attention was a minor gift. Serena stood slightly to his left, positioned in a way that read as professional while being something else entirely to anyone paying attention. Lydia's arrival did not announce itself. She crossed the terrace quietly, found her assigned table near the northern railing, and sat down. A server brought her water. She thanked him by name. She had looked up the catering team's event roster, a habit from the years when she helped organize functions for the firm, and he looked briefly startled and then pleased. It was Elliott who noticed her first. She saw it happen from across the terrace. The slight reorganization of his expression as his eyes passed over her table and registered that she was there. He had not expected her to come. She knew this because she had told him 3 days ago, neutrally, that she wasn't sure she'd feel up to it, a statement deliberately designed to lower his expectations. His expression now managed the flicker of surprise in under 2 seconds before recovering into something smooth and cordial. He excused himself from the investor group and walked toward her. Lydia. He stopped at the edge of her table. "I didn't think you were coming." "I wanted to be here," she said. "This is still the company my father built." He held her gaze for a moment, something careful in it, assessing. Then, "Of course, I'm glad," he said it in a tone that contained none of gladness. "You might be more comfortable at the table over there," a gesture toward the far side of the terrace, away from the stage area and the main investor cluster. "There's less foot traffic." She had already been seated where the table assignment card placed her. He was suggesting she move further away from the action. She noted this and said, "I'm fine here, thank you." Elliott's smile didn't shift. "Sure." "Elliott." He stopped. She kept her voice even. "You didn't put any of his work in the presentation materials, my father's, for the Valoris announcement." Something moved across his face that wasn't anger but was adjacent to it. "The presentation is forward-looking," he said. "That's the point of tonight." "Of course," she said. "I understand." He turned and walked back toward Serena, who had watched the exchange from a distance, and now offered him what Lydia could see, from 30 feet away, was a small, sympathetic eye roll. Serena crossed the terrace to Lydia's table perhaps 20 minutes later, holding her champagne glass with practiced ease. She was beautiful in an effortful, precise way, dressed to be remembered, speaking with the measured confidence of someone who had rehearsed social interactions, the way other people rehearsed presentations. "Lydia," she said warmly, as if they were acquaintances who ran into each other at events. "I'm glad you're feeling well enough to come. Elliott mentioned you hadn't been certain." "He mentioned that, did he?" Lydia said. "I know these things can be overwhelming." A soft and sympathetic inflection. "So many people, all the noise." Lydia looked at her directly. "I was at the firm's first investor dinner in the fall of 2002. I was 23. I helped my father set up the chairs." She let that sit for a moment. "These events have never been overwhelming for me." Serena's warmth adjusted slightly, recalibrated, still present, but more carefully contained. "That's wonderful," she said, after a beat. "A lot of history in this company." Yes, Lydia agreed. Quite a lot. Serena moved back toward Elliott's orbit without fully excusing herself, which Lydia had expected. She watched them together for a few minutes without making it visible that she was watching. She saw how Serena positioned herself, always slightly in front of Elliott when a camera was present, always in his immediate line of sight when he wasn't looking toward her. Lydia had studied people her whole life. She could read the geometry of it clearly. She could also read David Chen, who came to her table at 8:15, the city lights brightening behind him. He didn't sit. He just rested one hand briefly on the back of the empty chair beside her and looked at her with an expression that was not pity and not alarm, but something more solid than either. "Your father was very good at this," he said, "the long game." Lydia understood what he was saying. "He always told me, structure first, then patience." David Chen nodded once. Then he looked across the terrace to where Elliott was beginning to move toward the stage area, Serena beside him, and his expression did something complicated and brief. "Excuse me," he said, and moved away toward the back of the terrace. The stage lights came up. The applause that greeted Elliott when he stepped to the podium was genuine and substantial. 300 guests who had come tonight largely because of what he had built, and who understood, in the way that sophisticated investors understand these things, that a CEO who puts this kind of event together is a CEO who has confidence in what he's about to announce. The sound filled the terrace like warmth. Elliott stood in it and let himself feel it for a moment before adjusting the microphone. He began with gratitude, which was the right move. He thanked the board. He thanked the team. He thanked the investors who had been with Rhodes Capital Group since the early years, which phrasing drew some knowing nods from people who had attended the firm's first events when it was still called Harmon Capital Partners, though Elliott didn't name it that. He spoke with the practiced ease of someone who had given versions of this speech in his mind hundreds of times. Over the past 18 months it came out natural, precise, with the right pauses in the right places. Serena stood to the right of the stage, close enough to be visible to anyone watching Elliott, positioned with the careful intentionality of someone who understood that tonight was not just about a business announcement. She held her champagne glass lightly. When Elliott glanced toward her, she gave him the smallest composed smile. The board members were distributed through the crowd. Most had drinks. David Chen stood near the back railing. Marcus Hall was 3 tables in from the right edge. Genevieve Park, the board's most recently appointed member, had her phone in her hand at her side. At the podium, Elliott moved from gratitude into context, the growth trajectory of the firm, the market landscape, the strategic rationale for expansion. He was smooth here, drawing the narrative upward, building anticipation in the way a good speaker builds a room. He could feel the energy shifting toward the announcement, the guests leaning forward almost imperceptibly, the collective attention narrowing. "Which brings me," he said, his voice lifting slightly, "to what I've brought you all here tonight to hear." A pause, practiced. Rhodes Capital Group has entered into a definitive merger agreement with Valoris International, a partnership that will. 3 phones buzzed within 4 seconds of each other. The sound was barely audible under the terrace noise, but the effect of it was visible in 3 different parts of the crowd. A slight turn of the head, a quick glance downward, the particular stillness of someone receiving unexpected information. Genevieve Park looked at her screen. Marcus Hall looked at his screen, and then up at the podium without expression. David Chen did not look at his screen at all, because he had already read the notification Friday afternoon. Elliott continued. He was in the momentum of the speech now, and the phone sounds hadn't fully registered. A partnership that will triple our assets under management and position us as 2 more phones vibrated. Then another. Serena, watching from the right of the stage, saw something she couldn't immediately name-shift in the configuration of board members. She looked at Elliott's face. He was still speaking. She looked back at David Chen, who was moving slowly but deliberately from the back railing toward the edge of the stage area. "Position us as the leading independent investment manager in the Eastern Corridor," Elliott concluded, and I'm proud to say that the terms of this agreement represent. David Chen stepped to the foot of the stage. He did not interrupt the microphone. He simply appeared at Elliott's peripheral vision, a presence that was unmistakable enough that Elliott's eyes tracked to him mid-sentence. Elliott's cadence broke for a fraction of a second. He finished the sentence by reflex, represent the strongest strategic move in this firm's history. Then he looked directly at David. The laugh in his voice was automatic, the social lubrication of a man who has handled uncomfortable interruptions before. "I'm a little busy up here." David Chen did not smile back, he said, quietly enough that only Elliott and those immediately around the stage could hear clearly. "We need to pause, Elliott." The crowd sensed something. The energy of a room shifting is a physical thing, a slowing of movement. A drop in ambient noise, the collective awareness that something unscripted has happened. Elliott stared at David for a moment. His face was still controlled, still performing competence, but his eyes had lost the warmth they'd had 30 seconds ago. "Is there an issue with the venue? Because if it's technical, it's not technical." David's voice was level and specific in the way that serious people's voices become when they need to be clearly heard. "There's a majority shareholder objection filed against this merger. Filed Friday. The board was notified Friday evening." A pause. "We cannot proceed with a public announcement of a deal that the majority shareholder has formally rejected." The crowd heard enough of this. The ambient noise dropped by half. Somewhere to the left of the stage, a champagne glass was set carefully on a table. Elliott's expression did something complex and brief, processing, rerouting, landing on a version of calm that was visibly constructed. "I don't know what notification you received, but the trust structure is." He stopped. Started again. "The majority shareholder is the trust. The trust is managed administratively. It's not an active. The trust was activated Thursday," David said. "The trustee filed formal objection documents Friday through 2 separate attorneys. The corporate secretary confirmed receipt and sent board notification before 5 o'clock. Another pause. "The trustee is your wife, Elliott." The last 8 words landed in the quiet of the terrace with the weight of something that had been true for a long time and had simply been waiting to be said aloud. Elliott turned, slowly, as if some part of him had known before the rest of him was ready. He looked across the terrace and found Lydia at her table, dark green dress, her father's ring on her right hand, watching him with an expression that was completely still. He stared at her for 3 full seconds. She held his gaze without flinching. David Chidden said quietly, "We should step down." Elliott stepped off the stage without saying another word into the microphone, and the crowd let him, which was its own kind of statement. 300 people watching a CEO step back from a podium mid-announcement understood, at some level, that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for a long time. He moved to a quiet corner of the terrace near the northern railing, David Chen beside him, Philip Crane already rising from his seat with his briefcase. Serena remained where she had been, right off the stage, still holding her champagne, and watched the cluster form with an expression that Lydia recognized as controlled alarm. She didn't move toward it. She stayed where she was. Lydia rose from her table. She walked at a deliberate pace. She passed 2 investors she knew by name, nodded, didn't stop, and arrived at the railing as Elliott was still processing what David Chen had told him with the particular look of a man whose model of reality has just been formally contradicted. "The trust has been dormant for 5 years, Elliott was saying, his voice lowered and tight. "It's an administrative structure. It doesn't have active voting. The trust documents grant the trustee full voting authority upon formal activation," Philip said. He was professional, precise, not unkind. "The trustee filed activation on Thursday with the state registrar and with the company's corporate secretary. The activation is legally complete. The 51% voting interest is now operative." Elliott looked from Philip to David Chen, as if hoping one of them would correct the other. Neither did. This wasn't. The restructuring was supposed to address this. The Phase 2 proposal would have. The trustee also filed a formal objection to the Phase 2 share reclassification proposal, Philip said. That objection is operative as well. The proposal cannot move forward without majority shareholder approval. Something moved across Elliott's face that was not his usual controlled presentation. It was the face underneath the face, the one that appeared when the constructed version of things had stopped working. He had built 5 years of his identity on a particular understanding of what he owned and what he controlled, and the architecture of that understanding was being deconstructed in front of him on a rooftop terrace, in front of a portion of his own guest list. Lydia stopped 2 feet from the group. She didn't announce herself. She simply stood there until Elliott turned. He looked at her, and she could see the exact moment he tried to locate in her expression, something he could use, a crack of uncertainty, a hesitation he could negotiate with, some residue of the person who had always let things pass. He found none of those things. What she offered him was clear and still. Not cold, not triumphant, just certain. "You can't do this," he said. It was the first thing he said directly to her, and even now it carried the automatic authority of a man who had spent years being used to his assessments being correct. "I already did," she said. 3 days ago. A long pause. Around them, the board members who had gathered, David Chen, Marcus Hall, Genevieve Park, watched in the careful silence of people who understand that they are present for something that will define what comes after. "You're going to blow up the Valoris deal," Elliott said. "Do you understand what you're doing?" 18 months of work, a 3-way valuation. Regulatory filings in 2 jurisdictions. The investors in this room tonight were given an announcement for a deal that did not have majority shareholder approval, Lydia said. "That's not my problem, Elliott. That's yours. You chose not to run this through the trust because you were planning to restructure the trust out of existence." She paused. "You should have read the original shareholder agreement more carefully." Elliott's jaw tightened. He turned to Philip Crane as if Philip might offer a different interpretation of the documents that Philip himself had filed. Philip's expression offered no such thing. "I have to say something to the room," Elliott said. "Yes," Lydia said. "I'll go with you." Philip stepped forward and presented the board formally, with the documentation package he had prepared. The trust activation filing, the objection to the Valoris merger, the objection to the Phase 2 restructuring, and the formal notice of Lydia's standing as active controlling trustee. David Chen accepted the folder and passed it to Marcus Hall, who reviewed the first 2 pages and then looked up at Elliott with the expression of a man who has just had several months of quiet confusion suddenly resolve. "Why didn't you tell us the trust was active?" Marcus asked. Elliott was silent for a moment. Then, "I didn't know." It was the most honest thing he had said all evening. Lydia watched him process the full weight of that admission. She had sat across the breakfast table from this man for 7 years. She had read balance sheets for him when he didn't have time. She had attended events for him, defended his decisions to people who questioned them, given her father's company to him on the understanding that he would steward it with the same care that Thomas had built it. He had not. He had rebuilt it in his image and assumed that the name change was sufficient to make it his. He hadn't known about the trust because he hadn't looked. He hadn't looked because he hadn't expected her to be anything other than what he thought she was. She stepped slightly back and let the board members speak with Philip about next steps. She didn't need to be in the center of this. The legal work was already done. The rest was logistics. Across the terrace, she could see Serena setting down her champagne glass carefully on the edge of a catering table. She picked up her bag from the table where she'd placed it earlier. She was looking toward the stage, not toward the group at the railing, and her expression was the expression of someone running a very rapid calculation and arriving at a clear result. Elliott noticed too. He turned from the board conversation and looked toward Serena across the terrace. "Serena," he said, "loud enough to carry." She turned. She looked at him steadily, measuring. Then she said, from 30 feet away, in a tone that was completely professional, "I think you should speak with your counsel tonight, Elliott." She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. The doors opened. She stepped in. They closed. Elliott stared at the place where she had been for 2 seconds. Then he turned back to the board, to Philip Crane, to his wife standing 2 feet away with her father's ring on her hand, and for the first time all evening, the constructed certainty that he was the most powerful person in the room was simply gone. The gathering at the railing had become, in the way that things do when the main event has shifted off course, the actual event. Conversations across the terrace had quieted or turned toward the northern corner, where the board members stood with Philip Crane and the CEO and the woman in the dark green dress. Waiters continued to circulate with champagne, but fewer glasses were being taken now. The room was watching, with a particular patience of people who have learned that important information often travels best by observation. Lydia spoke to the board, not to the crowd. She addressed David Chen and Marcus Hall and Genevieve Park, in the measured tone she had used in every professional meeting she'd had, since she was 23 years old, specific, clear, without performance. She explained the trust structure in terms that were legible to anyone with a basic understanding of shareholder agreements. She acknowledged that the board had been operating without awareness of the trust's active status, which was not their fault. She outlined the two objections she had filed, the Valoris merger and the share reclassification. "I haven't rejected Valoris outright," she said. "I've paused it. The terms that were presented to me through the objection filings, which Philip provided as context, suggest the structure needs independent valuation review before a majority shareholder vote. That's standard practice for a deal of this size." She looked at David Chen. "I'd like to schedule a board meeting for next week. I want a full financial review of the Valoris terms before we proceed to any formal vote." "Twice." David Chen nodded. The nod of someone whose long career has given him enough experience to recognize when a room has recalibrated and what the correct response is. "We can do that," he said. "We'll have Walter coordinate." "Thank you." She turned to Marcus Hall. "I know this creates uncertainty for some of the investors here tonight. If any of them want to speak with me directly, I'm available. I'd rather they hear it from me than from a summary." Marcus Hall had a background in corporate governance that spanned 4 decades, and his expression carried something that Lydia read, carefully, as respect. Not sympathy. Respect. "I think that would be well received," he said. Elliott had stood through this without interrupting, which she had not fully expected. She thought he might try. She had prepared for it. But he had a particular quality when fully cornered that she had seen only once or twice in 7 years' stillness. When there was no move left that would work, he went still. He was still now. She looked at him. He looked at her. "After everything I put into this company," he said. Quiet, not for the room, just to her. "Everything I built." "Everything we built," she said, not cruelly. "With the foundation my father created. With the structure he built to protect his legacy. You ran it well for 5 years, Elliott. But you started dismantling things that weren't yours to dismantle." She paused. "You can stay on as CEO. That's a board decision, not a trustee decision, and you've done the operational work. But major decisions, significant transactions, structural changes, anything requiring majority shareholder approval, go through the trust now, through me. That's not a real role," he said. "That's a figurehead." She looked at him for a moment without rushing to answer. "It's the same role you gave me for 7 years, she said finally. "You managed it. I imagine you can too." He didn't have an answer for that. Philip Crane produced from his briefcase a sealed envelope that he placed in Elliott's hands. "That's from the trust. It outlines the governance terms under which your CEO appointment can continue pending board review. I'd recommend you read it tonight with your personal counsel." Elliott took the envelope without looking at Philip. His hands were steady, which she noticed. His face was not. The board members exchanged brief looks. David Chen said he would handle the room. Genevieve Park excused herself toward a group of investors who had begun asking questions of a junior staff member near the east railing. Marcus Hall followed. The legal work was done. The human part, the part where consequences began to compound and spread outward, was beginning. Lydia picked up her bag from the table where she'd left it. She didn't look back at Elliott. She walked along the railing toward the west side of the terrace where the noise was lower and the city lights were sharper, and she found the investor she had most wanted to speak with that evening, a man named Gordon Farr, who had been Thomas Harson's second institutional client and who had maintained his relationship with the firm through every change in the years since. He was 74, white-haired and sharp in the way that decades of pattern recognition produces. He was standing alone with a sparkling water, watching the room with the expression of someone who has seen this kind of evening before. "Gordon," she said. He turned. His expression moved through recognition into something that was not quite surprise. "Lydia Harmon," he said. "I haven't seen you at one of these in 4 years." "No," she said. "I've been managing things from a distance." He looked at her for a moment, at her father's signet ring, at the settled quality of her posture. "Your father would have found tonight interesting," he said. "He planned for it," she said. "He just hoped it wouldn't be necessary." Gordon Farr considered this. Then he raised his sparkling water very slightly, a small gesture, the gesture of someone acknowledging something real rather than performing a toast. "What happens now?" he asked. "The Valoris deal goes through a proper review," she said. "The restructuring proposal is withdrawn. The company continues." She paused. "What my father built continues." He nodded, slowly. The nod of someone who had known Thomas well enough to understand that this answer was, in its way, the answer Thomas would have given. "I'd like to hear your thoughts on the Valoris terms when you have time," she said. "You know the landscape better than most." "I'll call you next week," he said. She thanked him and moved on. There were 3 more investors she wanted to speak with before the evening ended. She had prepared for all of them. The gala ended 2 hours earlier than the program had indicated, not with an argument or a scene. There was no dramatic final confrontation, no security escorting anyone out, no public declaration that would give the evening more theater than it had already produced. The guests simply began to leave, in the way that people leave events when the main event has clearly passed, and what remains is the human sorting through that follows any significant shift. Conversations continued in the elevator lobby and on the sidewalk outside the Sterling, voices low, and careful in the manner of people who understood they had witnessed something they would need to calibrate their opinions about carefully before speaking them aloud. Lydia stayed for another 90 minutes after the stage lights went down. She spoke with Gordon Farr and 2 other longtime investors she had known since her father's time, giving each conversation the full attention it deserved. She spoke with Walter Reed, the corporate secretary, who handed her a summary of the formal notifications that had been sent and received, and who said very quietly, "Your father always ran a clean house. I'm glad someone is." She thanked him. Philip Crane found her near the window where he had spent most of the evening. His briefcase was back in his hand. He looked tired in the way that careful people look tired after a significant day, not drained, just finished. "You held it together well in there," he said. "I had a good example," she said. She meant Thomas. Philip nodded, understanding this. "The board will have a meeting scheduled by Monday. Walter will send the calendar. I'd like to be there, if that's acceptable." "Of course." She looked at him. "Philip, thank you for keeping everything in place all these years." He was quiet for a moment. "He trusted you," Philip said. "I was just maintaining what he built." She took the elevator down with 3 other guests who had also chosen to leave through the quiet side of the lobby. None of them spoke in the elevator, the particular silence of people who are each discussing something in their own way. On the ground floor, the city poured in through the revolving doors, October air carrying the particular sharpness that came with a cleared sky. Elliott was in the lobby. He was sitting in a chair near the elevator bank, the sealed envelope open in his hands, his jacket removed and folded over the arm of the chair. He had the expression of someone who had been reading the same paragraph repeatedly without processing it. When Lydia came through the elevator doors, he looked up. She stopped. She didn't approach, but she didn't keep walking either. "The board will do a review," she said, "of your leadership, of the Valoris terms, of the restructuring proposal. I'll be fair about it. I don't want the company destabilized. That's not in anyone's interest, including mine." She paused. "But it has to be done right, the way my father did things right." He looked at her for a long moment. All the performance was gone now, the smooth certainty, the practiced confidence, the manner that had worked in rooms for years. What was left was a man who had believed in a particular version of his own story and had just encountered the version that was actually true. I should have read the agreement, he said. Yes, she said. You should have. She had spent months preparing for this evening, and she had not prepared a closing speech for this moment. She discovered, standing in the lobby of the Sterling, that she didn't need one. The legal work was done. The human work, the slower, harder work of figuring out what came next had already begun, and it would proceed without a dramatic last word. She said, "Good night, Elliott," and she walked through the revolving doors. Outside, the street was quieter than the terrace had been, but the city carried its own constant sound, traffic and movement, and the ambient noise of 1,000,000 people going about their October evenings. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the air settle around her. She reached into her bag and touched the edge of her father's letter, folded where she had placed it weeks ago. She had read it 4 times since Philip gave it to her. She did not need to read it again to hear it. Her father had spent 30 years building something carefully. He had made sure it would last past him. He had trusted her with it, not because she was his daughter, but because he knew what she was capable of, what she had always been capable of, even when no one else was paying attention. She slid the letter back into her bag. She turned her collar up against the October air. She started walking. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that what belongs to you can never truly be taken, only temporarily forgotten, leave a comment below. Tell us whose quiet patience you've underestimated.